Have you ever seen someone give up their only meal, not because they were careless, but because they knew someone else needed it more? Today's story begins with a simple lunchbox, and ends with a life quietly transformed by compassion. If you believe kindness doesn't require wealth, just the right moment, go ahead and like this video. Stay with us till the end, because today, one of the wealthiest men in the city is about to learn his greatest lesson, from a young woman who has almost nothing left to give. What she did wasn't loud or heroic, but it changed everything. The small diner sat at the edge of a quiet intersection in downtown Cincinnati, the kind of place most people passed without noticing. Its yellow awning had faded under years of sun and snow, and the painted letters spelling out Sonny's Kitchen had begun to peel. Inside, the soft hum of a ceiling fan blended with the faint clatter of cutlery and the low murmur of lunchtime conversations. It wasn't busy, but it was warm, the kind of warm that smelled faintly of toast, brewed coffee, and something familiar. Frank Delaney sat alone at the corner booth, his tailored coat draped neatly beside him on the vinyl seat. At 63, Frank had long mastered the art of solitude. He wore it like another layer of his expensive suit. He was the man behind Delaney Developments, a real estate empire that had reshaped much of the Midwest skyline. His name opened doors, sealed deals, and caused nervous smiles in boardrooms. But here, in this small, scuffed-up diner, no one looked twice at him. Not that he noticed. Frank wasn't looking for attention, he was looking for quiet. The morning's meeting had drained him more than usual. A 4-hour negotiation with lawyers over zoning regulations. No raised voices, no accusations, just the slow, freezing erosion of humanity in the name of business. He'd barely spoken, he didn't need to. His team knew when to speak for him. Still, he left feeling as if a piece of himself had stayed behind in that glass-walled conference room. His coffee sat in front of him, half-drunk, now lukewarm. He didn't reach for it. His eyes were fixed on the window beside him, where the gray Ohio sky pressed heavily against the glass. Traffic moved without urgency. Pedestrians shuffled by, collars turned up against the wind. Then, movement inside the diner caught his eye. At a table near the front, just to the left of the entrance, a young woman untied her apron and folded it with the care of someone who had few things of her own and treated each one with respect. She was in her mid-20s. Maybe younger. Her brown hair was tied back loosely, a few strands falling across her cheek as she leaned down to slip the apron into a canvas tote bag. Her name tag, now half hidden under a denim jacket, read Rachel. Rachel Monroe. Frank had heard the manager say her name earlier, giving her the lunch schedule. She hadn't smiled much that morning, but she had moved with quiet purpose, refilling coffee, delivering plates, clearing tables without fuss. Now, as her shift came to a close, she slid into a chair by the window, her back to the room, as if needing a few moments to herself before facing the world again. She opened a small lunchbox. Not store-bought or trendy, just a simple plastic container with a worn lid. Inside, a turkey sandwich, neatly wrapped in wax paper, and a bright red apple. She unwrapped the sandwich with slow, deliberate hands. There was no phone, no earbuds, no scrolling or swiping, just a woman and her modest meal, sitting in a pocket of stillness inside a city that never really stopped. Frank watched, not out of curiosity, but something else, something quieter. She reminded him of someone. Or maybe of himself, a lifetime ago. Outside, the wind pushed harder, sending leaves skittering across the sidewalk. A boy passed the window, then stopped. He was maybe 9 or 10, too thin under a jacket that didn't fit, his jeans torn at the knee. He wasn't begging, not overtly. Just standing there, peering through the glass like someone looking in on a different world. His arms were folded tightly across his stomach, his eyes locked on the sandwich in Rachel's hands. Frank noticed it, but so did Rachel. And that changed everything. Rachel had always known how to make things stretch. Every dollar, every gallon of gas, every minute of rest. She'd learned to ration it all like someone who understood that nothing in life came without cost. Her mornings began before sunrise, walking 3 miles from the small duplex she shared with her grandmother in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. The old Buick in their driveway hadn't run in months, and even if it did, gas was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her grandmother, once a school librarian with the sharpest memory in the world, now moved slowly, her hands trembling from the Parkinson's that had begun to steal more than just her balance. Rachel handled the groceries, the bills, the medication schedule, and the never-ending march of small emergencies that came with being the only caregiver for someone whose body was slowly betraying them. The job at Sonny's Kitchen didn't pay much, but it helped. And she liked the quiet rhythm of serving others. It was honest work. That afternoon, with her shift finally over, she'd looked forward to that sandwich more than she cared to admit. Whole wheat bread, a few slices of turkey, some mustard, and a red apple, packed at 6 a.m. with a paper towel wrapped around it to keep it cool. It was something familiar in a day that often didn't allow for softness. She had just unwrapped it when she saw him. The boy stood just outside the diner window, framed by the chipped edge of the wooden door. He was small, maybe 10, his arms crossed tightly around his middle. His jacket was too thin for the wind, and the sleeves didn't quite reach his wrists. His jeans had holes at both knees. He wasn't begging. He wasn't crying. But his eyes, they held that dull, hungry stare that Rachel recognized in an instant. She'd seen that look before, in her own reflection years ago, back when she and her mom had lived out of a motel for a while. When dinners were boxed macaroni and shared sodas. When the idea of eating without worry felt like a dream for someone else's life. The kind of hunger that wasn't just in your stomach, it lived in your bones. And it changed the way you looked at the world. Rachel glanced down at her sandwich. She hadn't taken a bite yet. The boy's eyes followed every movement of her hands. No one else in the diner seemed to notice. A man at the counter scrolled through his phone. The manager was in the back. A couple talked quietly in a booth near the kitchen. But Frank Delaney, Rachel didn't know his name yet, watched from the corner with the stillness of someone who understood silence. Rachel stood up. She didn't hesitate. She tucked the sandwich back into the container, closed the lid over the apple, and walked to the door. The bell above it gave a soft chime as she stepped outside into the cold. The boy took a half step back, unsure. She knelt slightly, enough to meet him at eye level, and held out the container with both hands, not like she was handing over a spare thing, but something meant to be shared with dignity. "I think this was meant for you today," she said gently. The boy blinked, his lips parting like he wanted to say something, but couldn't. Instead he reached out, his hands dirty, his nails bitten down. He took the lunchbox and hugged it to his chest like it was a gift, not a meal. "Thank you," he whispered. Rachel gave a small nod, then stood and walked back into the diner. No dramatics, no second thoughts. She didn't look around to see who had noticed. She didn't announce what she had done. She just returned to her seat, poured herself a glass of water from the communal pitcher, and stared out the window as the boy disappeared down the block, clutching the meal like a secret. Frank Delaney hadn't planned to spend more than 20 minutes at Sonny's Kitchen. He had only come in to escape the cold, to give his assistant time to reschedule a meeting he no longer had the energy to attend. But as he sat in that corner booth with his half-empty coffee and a folder he had no interest in reading, he saw something that made him forget time altogether. He had noticed the boy even before Rachel did. The child's reflection caught briefly in the window, the tentative way he approached the glass, the way his eyes locked onto the sandwich like it was the only thing anchoring him to the moment. And then Rachel, moving quietly, deliberately, saw him too. Frank didn't move. He simply watched. No one else in the diner seemed particularly affected. A couple in the back whispered to each other and exchanged glances. A man at the counter raised his eyebrows and gave a subtle shrug, then went back to sipping his soup. One woman muttered something under her breath. Frank couldn't hear it, but the tone was clipped, disapproving. Another customer glanced toward the window and quickly looked away, as if acknowledging the boy might invite some moral obligation he didn't want to confront. But Rachel hadn't hesitated. Frank watched her hand the lunchbox to the boy. No flourish, no need to make a show of it. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was something else entirely, quiet, grounded, and whole. A kind of human clarity he hadn't seen in years. When she returned to the diner, the bell above the door gave a soft jingle. No one clapped. No one said a word. She walked back to her seat as if nothing had happened. She didn't straighten her shoulders like someone proud. She didn't shrink into herself either. She simply poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher on the side table, took a sip, and let her eyes drift back toward the window. Her sandwich was gone, but she didn't look hungry. Not in the way that mattered. Frank leaned back slightly, his hands folded loosely in his lap. He found himself staring, not at her face, but at her posture, her stillness, the weightless ease of someone who had done the right thing and didn't need anyone to notice. He tried to remember the last time he had seen something that pure. Outside, the boy had already disappeared down the block, but his presence still lingered like a faint echo. Frank's mind flickered back to his own childhood, to years of peanut butter sandwiches and public libraries and winters that bit through hand-me-down coats. He remembered a woman in a shelter once, gray coat, worn shoes, who had passed him half of her sandwich without a word, not because he'd asked, but because she'd seen him. He had forgotten that moment until now. Inside the diner, conversation resumed. Plates clinked, a dishwasher ran in the back, a delivery man entered with a box of soda syrups. Life moved forward, indifferent and unbothered. But Frank remained still. He studied Rachel as she stood and carried her empty glass to the bus bin near the kitchen. Her movements were efficient, practiced. She didn't linger, didn't perform. She looked like someone who had done this 1,000 times before, served people, cleaned up after them, then faded quietly into the background. She returned to the front counter and resumed wiping down the laminated menus with a rag that had seen better days. No medal. No applause. And that, Frank realized, made the moment matter even more. The lunch rush had begun to taper off, and the quiet hum of the diner returned to its usual rhythm. Rachel, now back behind the counter, moved with the same calm efficiency she always did. She checked the coffee levels, refilled the sugar caddies, wiped the surface beneath the register, her hand steady, her expression unchanged. Nothing in her demeanor suggested she had just given away her only meal of the day. Frank was still seated in his corner, his untouched coffee colder now than before. But his mind wasn't on his schedule, or the calls he'd missed. It was on her. The girl who gave her food to a boy no one else wanted to see. The manager emerged from the back office a few minutes later, clipboard in hand, reading glasses perched low on her nose. Her name was Marla, mid-40s, stern, practical, and always watching. She ran the place like a tight ship, and to be fair, she had to. Margins were thin. A bad review or a problematic customer could cause more damage than people realized. She didn't have time for sentiment. "Rachel," Marla called, her voice low but clipped. "Can I see you for a second?" Rachel looked up, nodded, and stepped over to the side hallway near the ice machine. It wasn't exactly private, but it was far enough from the tables to allow for a quiet reprimand. Frank couldn't hear every word from where he sat, but he caught enough. More than enough. "This is the second time," Marla said, her arms crossed tightly, tone flat. "You can't keep giving away personal food, especially not to people outside." Rachel didn't answer immediately. Her body was still, her hands clasped in front of her apron like a student waiting to be dismissed. "We don't want folks like that hanging around the windows," Marla added. "It makes people uncomfortable. We've talked about this before." Frank saw the flicker in Rachel's face. Not anger, not defiance, just something weary and quiet. She didn't argue. Didn't defend herself. She simply nodded. "Yes, ma'am," she said softly. "That's not professional," Marla went on. "This isn't a soup kitchen." "No, ma'am," Rachel replied again. There was a pause, and for a brief second, Marla seemed unsure how to continue. Maybe she expected pushback. Maybe part of her even respected Rachel for not giving it. But policy was policy. "Just, don't let it happen again," she said finally, before turning and walking back to the office. Rachel stood there a moment longer. She didn't sigh or shake her head. She simply returned to the counter, picked up a cloth, and continued wiping the front display case, like nothing had happened. But Frank had seen all of it. He wasn't a stranger to confrontation. In his world, conflict came wrapped in legal briefs and shareholder memos. But this small quiet punishment for doing something good, hit differently. There was no scandal, no raised voices. Just a girl being reminded that decency had no place on a time card. Frank's expression changed. For the first time in weeks, months maybe, he felt something stir beneath the hardened shell he wore like armor. He wasn't entirely sure what it was, but it rooted him to his seat. He watched Rachel move through the diner, unfazed, unbothered, unchanged. Except, he knew she had to feel it. That sting of being told she was wrong for doing what was right. He recognized it, because he had once known that feeling too. And it stayed with him long after the bell on the door jingled with the next customer. The midday lull had settled over Sonny's kitchen like a soft blanket. Most of the lunch crowd had cleared out, leaving behind the quiet hum of a dishwasher and the faint clink of silverware being rolled in napkins. Rachel, now back to her tasks, moved behind the counter with a slow, practiced rhythm. She didn't know who had seen what happened earlier, nor did she particularly care. The world kept turning, and she had a job to finish. Frank Delaney stood up from his corner booth, straightening his coat and brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. His coffee was cold, but he hadn't come for caffeine anyway. He picked up a small black leather card case from the table, flipped it open with a click, and removed one crisp business card. He walked toward the counter, his steps deliberate but not rushed. Rachel looked up as he approached. For a moment, their eyes met, hers cautious, his unreadable. Before she could say anything, he turned to the manager, who had just emerged from the office again with a clipboard in hand. Frank didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You just scolded the kindest person in this building," he said. Marla blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." He handed her the business card. Frank Delaney. Delaney Developments. Her face shifted. A flicker of recognition passed over her eyes. The name carried weight, not just in Cincinnati, but throughout the Midwest. Real estate, philanthropic grants, civic restoration projects. His signature had funded libraries, city parks, and luxury towers alike. He was one of those names that made people sit up straighter. Marla's posture changed instantly. Mr. Delaney, I didn't realize." Frank raised a hand, stopping her. "Doesn't matter. You didn't scold her because you knew who she was. You scolded her because you didn't." He turned then, eyes back on Rachel. "I saw what you did," he said simply. Rachel stood still, unsure how to respond. "I wasn't trying to make a scene." "You didn't," he replied. "That's what made it remarkable." She folded the rag in her hands, suddenly aware of how dry and frayed the edges were. It wasn't a big deal. "To you maybe," Frank said. "But I think you know better." There was a long pause. The diner seemed to hold its breath. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a second business card, this one with handwritten numbers across the back. "I'd like to speak with you," he said. 15 minutes. This afternoon. Somewhere quiet. Coffee shop around the corner." Rachel blinked. "Why?" "Because I think we might have something to talk about," he said, his voice steady, almost gentle. "And I think it's time someone actually listened to you." She hesitated. This wasn't normal. Strangers didn't offer meetings after lunch, especially not men in $1,000 coats with reputations tied to buildings taller than City Hall. But something in his tone, calm, sincere, made her pause. "I have to finish my shift," she said quietly. "I figured," Frank nodded. That's why I said this afternoon. When you're free. He left the card on the counter, just beside the tip jar, and stepped back. No pressure. No threats. Just an invitation. And then he walked out, the bell over the door giving one last chime behind him. Rachel stared at the card. It looked too crisp for a place like Sunny's. But there it was, with the ink still fresh on the back. Rachel wasn't sure what made her show up. She had finished her shift at Sunny's kitchen, taken off her apron, washed her hands twice to get the scent of bacon grease and dish soap off her fingers, and stared at the business card he had left on the counter. Frank Delaney. She had never heard of him. But the manager's reaction earlier told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't just anyone. Now, sitting at the corner table of a tiny cafe 2 blocks away, Rachel stirred a chipped mug of chamomile tea she hadn't touched. The chair beneath her creaked. The small room smelled of old books and cinnamon scones. Outside, the sky was turning that early winter gray that made everything feel like it was dimming just before nightfall. Frank sat across from her, a black notebook closed beside his cup. He didn't have the air of someone important. No assistant hovering nearby, no expensive laptop, no quick glances at a phone. He just sat there. Waiting. Patient. You probably think I'm here to apologize, he said finally, his voice low but warm. Rachel blinked. Aren't you? He smiled. No. Because I think if I say the wrong thing, it might sound like I'm apologizing for what you did. And I'm not. What you did was right. Rachel shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't used to praise. Especially not from men in pressed coats with silver cufflinks. I didn't do it for attention, she said, almost defensively. I know, he replied. She looked up at him, searching his face for judgment, agenda, anything. But there was only curiosity, and something softer. Something like memory. He leaned forward a little, his hands clasped loosely on the table. In the winter of 1974, he began, I was sleeping in a Greyhound station outside Cleveland. My mom had passed. I was 17. No diploma, no job, no roof. I remember the cold, how it felt like it got into your bones and made them hum. Rachel didn't speak, but her hands stilled. Every morning, he continued, this woman, middle-aged, wore orthopedic shoes. She came through the station. She never said anything. She just left half a sandwich on the bench across from mine. Different kinds every day. Turkey bologna, sometimes just cheese and mayo. But she never looked at me. She just left it. He paused. I don't know if she ever knew my name. But she saw me. And I swear to you, Rachel, that changed something. Because when you're invisible for too long, you start believing you don't exist. Rachel's eyes dropped to her lap. The memory of the boy from the diner lingered, his small fingers clutching the plastic lunchbox, the way he had looked at her like no one had in a long time. With trust. Frank leaned back. Today, when I saw you hand that boy your lunch, I remembered what that felt like. To not be invisible. I just thought he looked hungry, Rachel murmured. Frank nodded. Exactly. And you didn't just feed him. You gave him dignity. She looked out the window. The street was starting to empty. People rushing home from work, clutching grocery bags and steering strollers. She didn't feel like one of them. Not yet. I'm not qualified for anything big, she said quietly. I didn't finish college. I've worked at that diner since I was 21. I take care of my grandma. I don't have time or money or... I don't know what people like you even look for in someone. Frank was silent for a moment, then slid a folder across the table toward her. Inside was a printed overview, neatly formatted bullet points, photos of children receiving sandwiches beside vans with blue logos. At the top, Shelter and Dignity Initiative, Ohio launch plan. We've been trying to build something that works, he said. A mobile lunch unit program, vans that drive to schools, shelters, parks. Real food. Real schedules. We have vehicles, volunteers, logistics. What we don't have is someone who sees what we miss. Rachel flipped through the folder slowly. Flyers, maps, timelines. It looked official. It looked real. "I want you to be our field coordinator," he said. She looked up sharply. "Me?" "Yes. You." "I have no experience." "You have heart. You have instincts. You don't look away." His tone was firm now. Not harsh, but sure. "You saw a child in need. You didn't check with your manager. You didn't calculate the risk. You just moved. That's the kind of leadership we need." Rachel closed the folder, her hands slightly trembling. "I'm just a waitress." Frank leaned forward. "Not anymore. You're someone who sees." The silence that followed was thick, but not heavy. More like a stillness before a door opens. Rachel swallowed. "What if I mess it up?" Frank smiled. "Then we fix it. Together. But I'd rather build something imperfect with someone who cares, than something polished by people who don't." Outside, the wind rattled the cafe window. The world kept spinning. But inside, for the first time in years, Rachel didn't feel like she was just surviving. She felt, almost, like she was being invited into something that could matter. The sky over Cincinnati held that soft golden hue only found in early afternoon, the kind that made the air feel warmer than it was, even in mid-December. In the parking lot of St. Agnes Church, folding tables stood in rows, lined with bins of fruit, boxed lunches, and warm drinks. Children waited in small groups with wide eyes and empty stomachs, their worn jackets flapping in the breeze. The mobile food van, painted in calming shades of blue and white, bore a simple but powerful phrase across its side: shelter and dignity. Rachel stood at the front of the line wearing a deep navy coat with the organization's logo stitched just above her heart. Her posture was different now, more upright, more certain, not because she had figured everything out, but because she was standing in a place that felt earned. She handed out sandwiches with practiced ease, greeting each child with a smile, calling them by name when she could. There was a system now: lunch first, then juice or water, then fruit if they wanted it. Every child left the line with something warm in their hands and a sense that they mattered. She caught glimpses of herself in the van's windows now and then, the same face, the same eyes, but something deeper had shifted. She wasn't waiting tables. She was building something. The girl who had once rationed her own lunch now stood at the center of a machine designed to fight hunger, one sandwich at a time. A soft laugh pulled her attention away. She turned just in time to see a small figure darting through the line of crates and tables. A boy in a gray hoodie, his jeans still frayed, but his face lit up with recognition. It was him. The same boy from that day outside Sonny's kitchen. He didn't hesitate this time. He ran straight toward her, full of joy and something more: safety. Before Rachel could speak, his arms were around her waist in a tight, honest hug. "You came back," he whispered into her coat. Rachel knelt slightly and returned the hug, tears prickling her eyes. "So did you," she said. He pulled back, his smile shy but proud. "I brought my sister today. She's shy." Rachel looked past him and saw a younger girl, maybe 5, peeking out from behind a stack of boxes. She gave a small wave. Rachel waved back. The boy took his sandwich and water but lingered for a moment longer, as if trying to say something without words. Then quietly, he turned and led his sister toward a shaded bench nearby. Rachel stood there for a moment, absorbing it all: the laughter, the chatter, the sounds of children eating with their mouths full and hearts quiet. This wasn't a restaurant. It was a refuge. From a short distance away, Frank Delaney stood beneath the edge of a pop-up canopy, wearing a windbreaker and holding a case of bottled water. He wasn't giving orders. He wasn't taking credit. He was opening cases, passing out drinks, occasionally helping fix a sign knocked loose by the wind. He didn't introduce himself. No one here knew his name, not the way the city skyline did. And that's how he liked it. When their eyes met, Rachel gave him a nod, one of acknowledgement, not dependence. Frank returned it with a hint of a smile, then turned to help a volunteer sort more fruit into baskets. There was no speech, no fanfare, no official ribbon cutting. But everyone there knew something meaningful had begun. Lunch was being served. And it was complete, not because it was gourmet, not because it came in abundance, but because it came with intention. With dignity. Rachel took a deep breath and called out to the next child in line, her voice steady and warm. Sometimes, the most powerful acts of kindness don't come from abundance. They come from sacrifice, from the quiet courage to give when you barely have enough for yourself. It's easy to believe that generosity belongs to the rich, that to make a difference, you need wealth, influence, or a grand platform. But stories like Rachel's remind us that true giving starts with empathy, not excess. She didn't give away her sandwich because she had more waiting in the back. She didn't do it because someone was watching or because it would earn her praise. She gave it away because she recognized hunger, not just in the boy's stomach, but in his eyes. That unmistakable look of someone who has gone too long feeling unseen, unimportant, unwanted. She knew that feeling. And that made her act. What makes an act meaningful isn't how much it costs in dollars, but how deeply it comes from the heart. Rachel gave what she had, not what she didn't need. That lunch was her only meal of the day. Her feet were sore from hours of standing. She had bills waiting, a sick grandmother at home, and every reason to say, not today. But when she saw that boy's face, she remembered what it was like to be him. And in that moment her past, every hungry night, every skipped lunch, every cold walk home, became fuel for something greater. She took her pain and turned it into comfort for someone else. What she didn't know was that this simple silent action would ripple far beyond that afternoon. A sandwich became a spark. It reminded a hardened billionaire of his own invisible years. It exposed a flaw in a system that punished compassion. And ultimately, it opened the door to something neither of them expected, transformation. But here's the truth. Rachel didn't change because someone offered her a better job. She changed because someone saw what she had already done with almost nothing. Her story proves that when someone is willing to give the last of what they have, they're not just helping others. They're revealing a character that's ready to lead, to serve, to rebuild. We often overlook the quiet ones. The ones who don't raise their voice, who don't demand credit, who go home tired but proud. Yet these are the people who hold society together. People like Rachel, who give not because it's easy, but because they remember what it feels like to need. The world doesn't always reward those who give the most. But sometimes, someone notices. And when that happens, a single act of kindness can become the start of something much bigger. Because giving your only meal doesn't just feed a stomach, it feeds a soul. And in Rachel's case, it fed her future. It gave her a new place to stand, not behind a counter, but at the front of a movement. It gave her a new identity, not as just a waitress, but as someone who could see, act, and lead. All because she understood what hunger feels like, and refused to ignore it in someone else. So the next time you think your small act won't matter, remember this. It's not about what you have. It's about what you see. And sometimes, when you give away the very last thing you were saving for yourself, you end up receiving something far greater in return. A new chance. A new life. And maybe, just maybe, a world that learns to care again. They say you can tell everything about a person by what they do when no one's watching. Rachel didn't know Frank had seen her. She didn't know that a single act, handing a simple lunch to a hungry child, would ripple through a life she had no access to. She didn't know her choice would be noticed, remembered, and become the reason a new mission was born. But that's the thing about true kindness, it doesn't need an audience. Later, when someone asked Frank why he chose her, why this one waitress out of so many people with polished resumes and professional credentials, he didn't talk about her experience, or her availability, or even her potential. He said just one sentence. She didn't feed him because she had extra. She fed him because she knew what hunger feels like. And in that moment, everyone understood that this wasn't about food. It was about memory. It was about empathy. It was about someone who didn't look away. Because the people who remember what it's like to be hungry are the ones we can trust to feed the world. If you've ever felt too small to make a difference, remember this. Every change starts with one person willing to go hungry, so someone else doesn't have to. That person might be you. It doesn't take wealth. It doesn't take power. It just takes seeing someone and choosing not to look away. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. We tell stories that prove compassion still matters. And tell us in the comments. When was the last time you gave, not because you had extra, but because you understood?